Hey, I'm Matt Williamson and you're watching Pop Goes the 60s. Today I want to talk about two Beatles compilations, Beatles 1962 to 1966 and the Beatles 1967 to 1970, also called the Red and the Blue albums, which is so much easier to say. Now, these two compilations were, I would say, the perfect compilations at the perfect time, and they really were an excellent career capper to the band's recorded output. For the generation that followed, these compilations ended up being very important in growing the Beatles fan base. Now, even though I'm a second-generation Beatle fan, I did not grow up listening to these first. My buddy Dan had gotten 3 albums for his birthday, I think, from his sister. And from there, we loved them so much, we went in the record crates and pulled out a few more Beatle albums. Then his sister bought him a couple more albums. So we had relatively the whole catalog very early. But I ended up buying Dan one of these compilations for his birthday when he was 12. And we loved listening to the Red and Blue albums. And one thing I really liked about it is that it had the lyrics printed on the inner sleeve, which I always appreciated. One of the things I'd like to mention about these albums is that Capitol Records in the United States never released a greatest hits package while the Beatles were together. Now, I find this strange because what did Capitol do all through the early and mid-60s but butcher up their albums to create more product? And somehow a greatest hits collection was never compiled. And I think when we see Rolling Stones or the Beach Boys' career, who had multiple greatest hits in the 60s, I think that by waiting to the end of the Beatles' career after they broke up and doing a career-spanning retrospective, focusing on the greatest hits was just an excellent move. And I think that's what makes these compilations so strong, is that there was really nothing else like it that came out of the Beatles. Now, there was one in the UK, the Oldies But Goldies, which was a single disc. But nobody talks about that one too much. And I think these are considered as the definitive compilations of the group. Now, I'm going to take for granted that most of you know the track listings of these comps, and I'm not going to go into that too much. I think that they're overall excellent compilations. I mean, I would maybe make a tweak or two here or there, but it's negligible. I mean, they really nailed it on these. And there are some things that I think they could have done better. For example, on the Red album, each side averages about 15 and a half minutes. You know, each of the sides probably could have done with 8 songs. They could have given us a little bit more. On the Blue albums, those average about 24 and a half minutes per side. So there's a lot more music on the second set. And to just equal it out, maybe they could have put a few more songs on the first one, but that's minor. And one of the things they did do, since a single disc from 62 to 66 wouldn't wouldn't be enough space for all their greatest hits, that gave them the opportunity to expand and add popular album tracks as well. Tracks like Michelle, that was not a single, but it was a Song of the Year, it won a Grammy in 66, or A Day in the Life. Songs like that were popular and maybe got some radio airplay as album tracks, but were not singles. And other songs like You Got to Hide Your Love Away, In My Life, Drive My Car, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Across the Universe. These tracks became like greatest hits just by virtue of being a part of this collection. Now, I had mentioned the timing of the release of these, and it seemed like I didn't grow up. I was too young to know when these were released, although I was around. But it seems to me that Beatle fans were probably really jonesing for something positive to come from the Beatles at this point, because there had been a lot of squabbling after the breakup, and 71, 72 were pretty grim if you're Beatle fans. And the public went nuts over these. And the Red album went to number 3 on Billboard, and the Blue album went all the way to number 1. So both were gold records by the end of 73. And by the end of the decade, they sold like 5 or 6 million copies each. So they were very big. And one of the things I thought was very lucky for the Beatles are the photographs of this, the designs, because in America, we didn't know what Please Please Me was. I had never seen this photograph until this album. And the Get Back proposed photo, which was never used, boy, did they put these to great use. And talk about a perfect imagery for a career-capping retrospective. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of how these came to be. Now, I'm going to tell you something you probably never heard before, but here it goes. There was a bootleg set of albums that came out, and Apple figured out, well, we've got to stop this, so they came up with their own version of greatest hits. Well, what if I told you that wasn't true? What if I told you the opposite was true? That the Beatles had planned this and had been talking about it, and a company in the United States decided to steal Apple's thunder. Well, that is the story that's told by Peter Doggett in this book, You Never Give Me Your Money. Now, Peter Doggett is probably the authority on the Beatles' business dealings from the mid-60s through into the 21st century. And this book, if I were to ever recommend a Beatle book, this is one in my top 5. And he tells of all these very convoluted business problems the Beatles had. And he does it in layman's terms, so it's very understandable. He's an entertaining writer, and I'm getting this information from his book. The beginning of this project really begins in 1968 after the Hunter Davies biography came out on the Beatles. This was an authorized biography, and the Beatles didn't really like it, and that's why they decided to do a documentary film on their career. And this was the point when they were starting to really manage themselves. And Dennis O'Dell of Apple Films was tasked with gathering all the newsreel footage he could and whatever film he could get on the Beatles to start compiling a story. And this eventually took on the title of The Long and Winding Road, but originally it was called Scrapbook. One thing I always wondered was if the release of that final single in the United States, The Long and Winding Road, had anything to do with this film. And I have no idea, I've not seen that anywhere, but I thought, well, maybe that's the reason the film was titled that, because this film was actually supposed to come out in 1970, believe it or not. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced he was basically leaving the band, and that essentially announced the breakup of the group, but that didn't stop production on this film. And there was a work print that was made, and Apple said it would be in cinemas by 1970. They went so far as to talk about the style of it. It would be a split screen that was much like the recently released Woodstock film. Now, the Beatles Monthly magazine in October of 1970 also printed that this would be out in time for Christmas. Unfortunately, by late 1970, the band's legal problems really started to hit the fan. Paul McCartney pulled his support from this, so Neil Aspinall put this whole project on hold. Before he did, he started his own company, and he took all the film from it and he kept that himself to kind of protect it from potentially Klein maybe seizing it. So nothing seemed to move on this project in 1971, but in 1972, Apple Corps announced that the title of this film had been renamed 10 Years in the Life of the Beatles. So there was still talk about this whole project, but by late 1972, the 3 Beatles that were employing Klein, Lennon, Harrison, and Starr, were starting to think about getting rid of him. And things weren't going well for Harrison. There were some problems between him and Klein over the Concert for Bangladesh album. There was a tax issue there. John Lennon was coming off a very poor selling and critically dismissed album in Sometime in New York City. They were also, they didn't like the fact that Yoko Ono wasn't being promoted more. So there were things going on in the Beatle camp. Obviously, Paul McCartney had nothing to do with Klein, so he didn't want anything to do with this project or anything about the Beatles. He was trying to form his own career and get his career on track. So Klein, I think, was realizing things were not going that well. So anything that the Beatles sold, he got a royalty on. So some of the there wasn't really any new studio albums from Ringo or George in 71 and 72, and John's recent album didn't do well. So he decided to come up with a set of albums to go along with the Long and Winding Road project, which is now called 10 Years in the Life of the Beatles. And he wanted to resurrect this film project because he knew that that would be a big moneymaker, not just for the Beatles, but for him as well. Now, even though Klein was trying to get back in the band's good graces, his contract was up at the end of February of 1973. So this project was probably started, I'm not sure when, but it had to be probably later in 72. And according to John Lennon, George Harrison controlled the choice of material on those albums more than any of us. They sent me lists and asked for my opinion, but I was busy at the time, and Paul had even less interest. So I was kind of surprised to see that George was the one spearheading some of this track selection on here. And he also comes into play a little bit more. I'll get to that in a minute. So news of this project had filtered out, and there was a company in the United States that produced bootlegs that wanted to steal Apple's thunder and release a 4-album set to go along with this proposed film. And this company was called Audiotape Inc. And this is the compilation that they came out with. This is called Beatles Alpha Omega. It came out in January of 1973. Now, Klein was due to, his contract was going to either be extended or expire at the end of February. So the Beatles were hedging their bets a little bit, and they extended him a couple of times for a week, couple weeks at a time, and that was going on while this came out. Now, what Klein did is they, on behalf of George Harrison, Capitol Records, and Apple Records, Klein filed a lawsuit against Audiotapes Inc. and ABC and the affiliates they were advertising this package. So the affiliates immediately stopped advertising it, and the lawsuit was for $15 million in damages. So that's the beginning. So let's talk about this a little bit here. I'm sure many of you have seen this Alpha Omega collection, and it's a little confusing because it doesn't really look like a legitimate release, and it's not, because there's no licensing involved in this. And one of the things that is confusing about this is there's several different variations on the jackets, at least, or these boxes. Let me just show you the box here for those of you who haven't seen it. And it's just a real simple box with 4 discs inside, and the labels look pretty bootleggy, nothing fancy. And one of the variations that you'll see on this is that this other jackets were printed in black and white. So after the black and white variation, they changed the name of the title to Beatles Volume 1. And that also came with a color variation where John is blue and Paul is red. Then after that, we had an actual Volume 2 come out with different tracks. There are even copies sent out that didn't print all the colors like this one that's just blue and doesn't even have the Paul in the circle. This sold on eBay recently for big money, but this is the kind of stuff they were sending out to people. And then there was even a Volume 3, but it still was listed as Volume 2 on the outside of the box. And they probably just had leftover boxes. This is how slipshod this operation was. So the tracks on here are all over the map. One of the things that is interesting about this is that it includes some solo Beatles tracks. And over the course of the 3 sets, which total like 12 discs, which is virtually the whole Beatles catalog, they included songs like Imagine, Bangladesh, Uncle Albert, It Don't Come Easy, My Sweet Lord, Heart of the Country, Wah Wah, Crippled Inside, The Lovely Linda, Backseat of My Car, Oh Yoko, All Things Must Pass, and Apple Scruffs. So that's 14 additional tracks that are solo tracks that were added to these compilations. As you might guess, do not have good sound quality. These were recorded off of vinyl copies, and you get some bad endings and some hard endings and some missing fade outs. They even have, one song they have on one of these compilations is the song Pepperland from the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But this retailed at about $13.98. So it was about half the price to buy these 2 guys right here. I'm not sure what these retailed at about, but this was this would have been about double the cost of this, roughly speaking. And they could afford to charge less because they weren't paying any royalties to anybody. So when this was released, Apple responded, and this was also in the dying days of dumping Klein. So Apple and Capitol they wanted these out right away, but the Beatles stalled. And these did not come out till April 10th of 1973. And the reason for the stall had to do with waiting for Klein to not be renewed. Because if he was still their manager when these came out, he would get a percentage of these sales. And these were some very big sales. So the Beatles were being very frugal in their handling of the situation. So it's not really, they could have come out earlier and competed more head-on with these, but I don't know. I have no idea how many of these were sold. There aren't sales numbers on it because they were unofficial. So I really don't know how much money was made on those. The court records are still available, but apparently some of the folder is empty, so the settlement is unknown. So how could this company, Audiotape Inc., do this and get away with this? Well, let me talk about the copyright laws at the time. Because before 1972, there really weren't federal laws protecting sound copyright, unbelievably. So what this company in New Jersey did is they were trying to take advantage of the laws that existed. There was a new law that came out in 72 that did protect copyright of music, but prior to that, it was not a federal law. It was handled state to state. And apparently New Jersey, where this company was located, was rather lax on those laws. So they rolled the dice and they tried to do their own thing. Now, the Sound Recording Amendment of 1971 extended federal copyright to recordings fixed on or after February 15th, 1972. So those solo songs that I mentioned that are on here are were recorded before that date. So before that date, I mean, the laws were very pirate friendly, and the bootleg industry, which started probably with the basement tapes with Dylan's work in 1967, and then the Beatles would get back stuff, that kind of started the whole bootleg industry. And they could get around that a little bit because of these lax laws state to state. So after giving you guys the sales numbers of these two just off the bat, it seems like this didn't really harm the sales of this too much. And this is a forgotten release. And it's kind of a nice little curio to have, I suppose, but these are so much better. So despite the legal issues of this release and the things surrounding this release, they were big hits, and the film that was usually still called The Long and Winding Road, that was still in production, and John Lennon even mentioned that in the press in 1974. And there was a rough cut that was made, and it was that cut that George Harrison showed Eric Idle for him to use to create the parody of the Ruddles. That was the first use of it, really, which is kind of hilarious. And then as the decade went on, I think it was also used as kind of a basis for The Complete Beatles, which was released in 1982. That is a brief history of the Red and the Blue albums. I know these albums are close to many of your hearts, and I can totally see why. I consider them part of the main Beatles discography, and as I said earlier, I think they are the perfect coda to the recording career. I really appreciate you watching. I've got plenty more Beatle videos coming, so do stay tuned to Pop Goes the 60s.